Sorry about that, guys. Okay. So I'm happy to introduce today's presenter, Attorney Robert Zaruta. Mr. Zaruta practices labor and employment law with the Knox Law Firm. He works with both private and public employers, counseling clients on hiring and firing issues, collective bargaining, and compliance with workplace laws, including FMLA, ADA, USERRA, and more. Mr. Zaruta offers sexual harassment training for employers, assists employers in handling sexual harassment complaints, and conducts internal investigations. He has represented employers in unfair labor practices, actions including appearances before the Supreme Court of PA, the Commonwealth Court of PA, and the National Labor Relations, Board of the PA Labor Relations Board. So with all of that, he's going to share his knowledge and all the things that we've learned so far about COVID and the vaccines that are out. We're excited to have him here with us this morning. So I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Mr. Zaruta.
Thanks, Molly. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad you all joined me this morning. I want to thank Molly and the IRC for putting together this presentation. This is not the first presentation I've done related to employer issues, and I strongly encourage all of you to take advantage of the IRC's presentations when it comes to these presentations for employers. I really think that they are very beneficial and a great resource. So with that being said, my name is Bob Zaruta. I'm an attorney at the Knox Law Firm. As Molly said, I specialize in labor and employment issues, including workers' compensation. Today's presentation, as Molly said, is on the Employer's Guide to COVID-19 Vaccinations, as well as some other related topics. It's really been a crazy past 11 months or so. I don't have to tell you that. And that's true in my line of work and likely in your line of work as well. We've had the FFCRA with paid leave, paid sick leave, the extended FMLA. We had PPP loans, we had layoffs and recalls for a lot of employers, and then we had to deal with changes to the unemployment compensation law as well. Now we have COVID-19 vaccinations. And so the question that has been coming up is, a couple questions is, related to whether or not you can mandate them, and if so, what are the consequences, the pros and cons, and so forth. So I'm going to go into detail about what you can do, what you can't do, and some concerns you may want to have here. And even though vaccinations are still out of reach for most of us, it appears that access to this vaccination is likely going to be available to most of us by the summertime. So I do think this issue is going to come to a head, and employers are going to have to address it one way or the other. This means that employers will be given the opportunity to decide if they want to mandate vaccinations or not. The question becomes whether or not the employees, when given the opportunity to, are going to actually get the vaccination. Now, this may come as a surprise, but the Erie Times published a study a few weeks ago, I believe, where they surveyed about 800 people in Erie County, and only 50%, approximately 50%, said they would get the vaccination. This may seem like a surprise to some of you, but I can tell you that my firm represents some healthcare providers, whether it be nursing homes or other type of healthcare providers, and the consensus there is about 50 to 60% of even those workers, those healthcare providers, are willing to get the vaccination. The others seem not willing to get it. So the question becomes for you as an employer, do you want to mandate it? And especially when encouraging employees to get it may only work for 50 to 60% of them. I'm not here to take a position on whether or not one should take the vaccine or whether or not employers should mandate it. I'm only here to help employers kind of navigate through the issue based on their position, whatever they decide is in the best interest of their company. If you want to mandate it, okay, that's fine. Here's what you have to be aware of. If you don't want to mandate it, that's fine as well. But here's what you should be aware of. So I'm just trying to prepare everybody along the spectrum to deal with this issue. I can tell you that even though it has been brought up online and through different discussions, I have not actually had any clients, and I'm not aware of any clients that we represent from a labor and employment perspective who are actually mandating the vaccinations for employees right now. Now, keep in mind, the vaccinations are not available to a majority of people right now. But so far, there's no movement. I guess we're going to have to see and wait to see how that plays out as vaccines become more available. But regardless, I think this presentation is going to be helpful. It's going to provide you with some information to consider, which will help you and your company make a decision whether or not you want to mandate it. It's going to go into pretty good detail to give you all, at least raise some questions and have a discussion as to whether or not you want to mandate it. So, Molly, can we move to the next slide? Okay, so this slide, this is basically what we're going to address today. The first question, obviously the most important question is, can an employer mandate vaccination for its employees? Generally, the answer is yes. And I'll go into more detail, but the law allows employers to mandate vaccinations with some exceptions to the rule, and some things you must consider along the way. The second issue is should employers mandate the COVID-19 vaccination for their employers? Again, I'm not here to make a decision for you. I'm here to provide you the pros and cons and the issues that may arise, and that's for you really to decide what's best for you and your workforce and for your company. Number three, what are legal considerations with respect to mandatory vaccinations? We're going to go into in a little more detail into legal considerations involving the mandatory vaccination, which includes issues such as Title VII, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and and in those when those situations arise where there are exceptions to the general rule, I'm going to walk you through the process you have to go through as far as providing a reasonable accommodation and assessing whether or not allowing an unvaccinated person into your work environment will cause a direct threat to your workforce. And then finally, I'm going to touch on some liability issues. The issue has come up, can employers be held liable for mandating the vaccines if something were to go wrong with the vaccine? And on the other side, can employers be liable for not mandating the vaccine if there's some sort of outbreak? So I'm going to touch on those as we move forward. Next slide, please. All right, so before I get too far into this, I want to take a step back and quickly talk about the vaccination and its effectiveness. Now, I'm not a physician. I'm an attorney who is simply providing information that is provided through the CDC. I know that there are some strong opinions on vaccinations on both sides, which I fully respect, and I'm not giving my opinion. I'm just really reciting what information is found on the CDC's website. The CDC did update their website. I think the most recent one is January 25th, 2021, with some information pertaining to the vaccine and its effectiveness. I'm going to go through a little information on the website because I think it might be helpful to you and for your employees to kind of understand and answer some of the questions they may have along the way if you do decide to mandate the vaccination. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the main questions which is addressed, the big question on the CDC website is, will a COVID-19 vaccination protect the individual against getting sick with COVID? According to the CDC, the answer is yes, it will. The CDC says that the vaccine essentially teaches your immune system how to recognize the virus and how to fight it, which in turn protects you from getting sick. Next slide. Okay, so this is a popular question too, is which lasts longer, the immunity after getting COVID-19 or protection from getting COVID-19 vaccinations? So we've always probably heard at one time or another that, if you actually contract the virus and you make it through, that there's a period of time, at least a few months, where you're kind of immune or you're not able to get the virus anymore. I think there's a lot of open questions as to the extent of that immunity. I don't think we really have answers to it. I don't think the CDC does either. And so if you go onto the CDC website, what they essentially say is that there is some consensus that there's some level of immunity after it, but it's unclear how long you're going to be immune from it. And that beyond 90 days, they say that it's unclear whether or not your immunity survives after contracting COVID-19. Next slide, please. So then with that in mind, the question is, if you've already had COVID-19 or your employees have and they've recovered, do they still need to get vaccinated? And the CDC is pretty clear on this. They say yes. They say there's severe health concerns and risks, and so you need to better off to get it, and because we really don't know the extent of the immunity after contracting the virus. And I think this is probably an area that is going to evolve as time goes on. I think we're going to see as we get more information, we may be updating, have an updated idea of how long you're actually going to be immune after you contract the virus. But for the time being, I think out of an abundance of caution, the CDC is basically saying, even if you had it, get it anyway, just to be safe. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, the question is raised, should an individual who gets the vaccination still have to wear a mask and to avoid close contact with others? The CDC again says yes. The natural question is, well, if the vaccine actually works, why is continuation of the mask and distance requirements necessary? Like I said, I'm not a physician, so I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not sure if the CDC is really sure about the answer to this either, but I think that they're taking an abundance of caution and just recommending that for the time being, until we kind of realize how effective this vaccine is going to be, until we learn more about how long immunity lasts, and the different mutations of the virus, I think they're going to recommend that you still wear the mask. And I do not see that going away. I do not see distance requirements going away anytime soon. I don't want to predict, but I would say I'm pretty confident you're not going to see them removed through the end of the year. Next slide, please. Okay, so I do want to briefly talk about the emergency use authorization here. So COVID-19 vaccines are only available through the emergency use authorization. So as many of you may know, there's a normal process for FDA approval, which is a lot longer typically than what has been used for the COVID-19 vaccination. And so in an effort to get these vaccines out there as quick as possible, I don't want to say we cut corners, but we shorten the process. We remove some of the red tape to make it available quicker. And so there are kind of pros and cons and concerns related to getting approval quicker. And so the fact that this is an emergency use authorization as compared to a regular full FDA review and approval is significant, and I'm going to explain why. Next slide. Okay, because the COVID-19 vaccination is an emergency use authorization, the FDA actually has an obligation to ensure that recipients of the vaccination are informed of four major things. First, they must tell them that it is authorized under the emergency use of the vaccine. They must tell them the known and potential benefits and risks. They also must tell them the extent to which the benefits have and risks are unknown. They must tell them they have an option to accept or refuse the vaccination, and they must tell them if any available alternatives are available. So the one thing that jumps out here is number 4, which is they're told they have an option to accept or refuse vaccination. Now, from a practical sense, if you're as an employer want to mandate this and you get a third-party healthcare provider to provide the vaccinations, and you tell your employees, go ahead, you're going to go to this site and you're going to get the vaccination. When they go to that site, they're likely going to see a poster, an FDA poster with all this information that's contained on this screen. And one of the pieces of information that is contained is that they have the option to accept or refuse the vaccination. Now, that could cause some confusion because here you are as an employer telling them you have to get this, and then you have a sign that says you can refuse it if you want to. So I tell you this because even, obviously your interests are different than the FDA's interests. The FDA cannot require individuals to get it. But you as an employer, provided you're within those exceptions, you are able to require it. So there might be some confusion from your employees. So just be prepared for that if that situation does arise. Next slide, please. Okay, so back to the main issue here, which is the legality of mandatory vaccination policies for employees. As I stated before, employers are generally allowed to mandate vaccinations for employees with some exceptions. Now, the EOC has issued some guidance related to the COVID-19 vaccination. I believe it was updated as recently as December 16th of 2020. Now, the EOC guidance does not specifically state that employers are allowed to mandate the vaccination for employees. However, if you look at the frequently asked questions, you will see that a lot of the questions asked and answers provided suggest or work on the assumption that an employer can or has mandated the vaccination. By way of example, one of the frequently asked questions on the website is, if the employer requires the employee to receive the vaccination, what questions can ask as part of the screening process? So you see, they're not specifically telling you you're allowed to do it, but they're suggesting that it is legally permissible, provided that it's done in the correct way. Next slide, please. Okay. So the guidance also makes it clear that vaccine mandates for employees may implicate a number of federal laws. And I kind of touched on this already before. Some of those laws include the ADA, they include the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is also known as GINA, and also religious protections under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So in the next few slides, I'm going to go through in a little more detail how to deal with issues related to these categories of employees. Next slide. Next slide, please. One more. Okay, so the EOC's guidance makes it clear that employers who adopt mandatory vaccination policies may be obligated to provide exemptions or accommodations to employees with religious objections to the vaccine, pregnant workers, or employees with disabilities. Now, this should not come as a surprise to us. We all, live in the HR world where, there are protected classes and there are people who, are protected from discrimination and are entitled to reasonable accommodations in certain areas. And, for this particular issue, we're really focusing on three categories of employees: those with disabilities. In that case, it's basically somebody who has an underlying condition which could cause them harm if they're required to get the vaccinations. So for all intents and purposes, they are not able to get the vaccination. Pregnant employees, there's often restrictions on what they can eat, what they can put into their body, and so that's another protected group. And then finally, employees with religious, sincerely held religious beliefs that are against getting a vaccination. So I think they're mostly self-explanatory. I'm going to go into a little more detail about some of them in the next couple of minutes, but those are the three main groups. And so when we're dealing with these groups, and again, I'm going to go into this more detail, but it's the same process generally that you apply for somebody who has a disability and you're trying to accommodate them. It's an interactive process. It's an open dialogue. It's a gathering of information and then trying to work with them to see if there is a accommodation that you can provide for them. So it's something you should be familiar with. This is not like a new process. It's just related to a different topic. Next slide, please. So one of the burning questions from employers and employment attorneys was whether the EEOC was going to treat the administration of the COVID-19 vaccine as a quote medical examination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in its guidance, the EEOC has made it clear that the administration of a COVID-19 vaccination to an employee by an employer is not considered a medical examination under the ADA. So this is very important. So as you all likely know, if you're dealing with a pre-employment medical examination, you're not allowed, that's unlawful. Any pre-employment medical examination is unlawful. If you offer the job to somebody, but before they start, you are in certain cases permitted to do a medical examination. But when it comes to current employees, an employer is not allowed to require an employee to have a medical examination under the ADA unless they establish that it's job related and consistent with business necessity. And that's a burden that's going to be placed on the employer. So the good news is the EEOC's position on this, and that it is not a medical examination, means that you can require it and still not be in violation. You don't have to prove that it's job related or consistent with business necessity. Okay, next, please. And that being said, while the administration of vaccine, while you are allowed to require it, the pre-screening questions that are going to be asked, are likely going to be asked before somebody gets the vaccination, you have to be careful with those. Okay, so when an employer or a third party is providing the vaccination, typically there are pre-screening questions that are asked, and some of those questions may elicit information that talks about a disability. And so I think it's very important to be familiar with the questions that are being asked and to make sure that those questions do not elicit information about disability, because that would be a violation. And that would be considered a a medical inquiry under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which would be illegal unless you can show that it's, again, job related and consistent with the business necessity. So, I encourage all of you to go on to the CDC's website. They do have a list of typical screening questions that are being asked. And I think it's important that you know what these questions are and make sure that none of them touch on disability related items. Like, for example, some of the questions may say, okay, ask an employee if they have a bleeding disorder or if they have a weakened immune system caused by cancer. Now, these questions are important for the person providing the injection because, or the vaccination, because they need to know if it's safe to give this person this vaccination. So while it's important to them, even though a third-party provider is providing this to them, that is still be considered a medical inquiry by you if it touches on a disability-related item. So it is tricky to get around this issue. And again, the burden's on the employer to show that if these questions do touch on topics of disability-related items, you're going to have to prove that it's job-related and consistent with business necessity. So like I said, I would say that before you go down the road of wanting to mandate this, I would say you need to really look into what questions are going to be asked, whether they're asked by you or asked by a third-party provider, just to make sure and have legal counsel review them, because you want to make sure you're not asking questions that are going to get you in trouble or extend liability to you through the ADA. Next slide, please. Okay, so the question comes up: can an employer request proof that an employee has been vaccinated? And the EEOC says yes. The EEOC holds this position despite the ADA's restrictions on disability-related inquiries that we just discussed. And how does this make sense? It makes sense because the EEOC is convinced, and I agree, that asking somebody if they have received the vaccination is not likely to elicit disability-related information. It's a yes or no question. Okay. Now, turn to next slide, please. Now, even though you're allowed to ask whether or not they have taken it, they've had a vaccination, the next question, which could potentially get you in trouble, is if they say no, and then you ask a follow-up question, why haven't you received it, or why can't you receive it? That question is a problem, because that question is likely to elicit disability-related information, and it would be subject to the ADA standard for such inquiries, which means it has to be job-related and consistent with business necessity. So the question becomes, well, if you mandate the vaccination for an employee and the employee states that he did not receive the vaccination, how do you know if that person falls within the exceptions to the rule? Because that's something we have to consider, right? If we're going to mandate this vaccination, we got to make sure that we're not infringing on somebody's protected rights here. And so the way you deal with it is the same way you would deal with a disability issue. When somebody, when you're having a conversation, someone says, I can't come in and work, I can't work this job because this part of my job, I'm just unable to do it. So as part of the ADA accommodation process, you would ask questions. You'd have them fill out a questionnaire. You'd have their doctors provide information. And there are certain questions you can ask which do not elicit disability-related information, but do give you the information you need to have to determine if a reasonable accommodation is possible and what reasonable accommodation you should provide. So I'm sure most of you probably have a standard form questionnaire for the employee and a separate questionnaire for the physician to fill out related to reasonable accommodation request. If you don't, I suggest you probably work on getting them. But they do have questions in there, and it'll be simple, like, here are the essential duties of your job. Are you able to perform these? If not, what medical conditions, or do you have medical conditions that restrict your ability to perform any of these? You're not asking specifically what is your medical condition. You're asking, what are your actual restrictions? I can lift 10 pounds. Okay, well that's a restriction that doesn't talk about an actual disability. So there are ways around it. So I encourage you to really take a look at your ADA reasonable accommodation request forms. If you don't have them, work with counsel to get them prepared and make sure they're on point, because this issue may come up again and again. Next question, please. Next slide, please. Sorry. Slide number 18. So this is, so we know the main exceptions to the general rule that employers can mandate vaccines for employees. again, their disability, pregnancy, and then also when there's a strongly held religious belief. So most of these are self-explanatory. I'm not going to go into detail with them, but the one I want to touch on a little bit is the religious portion of it, because I think that one's a little less known and a little less obvious. So this protection comes from Title VII. Importantly, the law protects not only people who belong to traditional organized religions, but it also covers anyone who has sincerely held religious, ethical, or moral beliefs. So it's broader than you may think. And so that's important to note. If an employee comes to you with letting you know that they oppose this, you got to be careful about coming down on them too hard, saying, well, I don't think this is legit belief. It's pretty broad, so you have to kind of work with them on it. So the question becomes, if you have an employee that comes to you and they say, well, you mandated vaccinations, but I have this disability, or I'm pregnant, or I have this strictly held religious belief and I can't get it. What's the next step? So over the next couple of slides, I'm going to go through kind of a step-by-step process on how you deal with that situation. So next slide, please. Okay, so here's the EOC's recent guidance for employers on how to evaluate an employee who cannot receive the vaccine due to a medical condition or a disability. So the guidance states that employers who are faced with an employee in this situation must conduct an individualized assessment in determining whether a direct threat exists. So I'm going to break it down to kind of explain to you what that means. So what you have to do is you have to basically look at the duration of the risk, nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood of the potential harm, and the imminence of the potential harm. If you as an employer reach the conclusion that this unvaccinated person poses a direct threat, you really have to reach the determination that they're going to expose other people to the virus at the work site. So that's a pretty high burden, and it probably doesn't provide you much help. A lot of you are probably saying, well, this is great information, but where does that leave us? We still have questions. How do I know the likelihood of the potential harm? I just run a business, and that's a good question. And unfortunately, this is not a black and white issue where it's going to be clear. But I will tell you this: there are ways to kind of dig into this. So, for example, if you as a company decide to mandate vaccinations, and then you have individuals who, for one of the stated reasons, cannot get the vaccination, you have to do an assessment if this person is going to provide a direct threat to the workforce. So the questions you ask, what is the work environment like? Are people spread out? Is everyone wearing a mask? Do people have their own offices? Do you have an up-to-date or advanced ventilation system? I know that there are filters that are put on ventilation systems now that kill 98%. And so the question becomes, can you make it? Can you eliminate the harm or reduce the potential threat here by moving them around, by spreading them out, or just by following your normal policy, which is, stay away from people, stay behind your plexiglass. If you can reduce that threat or eliminate that threat, then you're going to have to accommodate them. And so one thing I'll ask you to do is, take a look at the CDC and the OSHA requirements. If you can comply with all those requirements, it's essentially a safe workplace. I mean, we've been working under these conditions for a long time. But for those of you who are back in an actual work site and who have installed policies such as wearing a mask, such as maybe closing your door if you work in an office, putting up plexiglass, if you are able to be in compliance with the CDC and OSHA guidelines, I think that you're likely to conclude that the direct threat does not exist. So if you're hoping to preclude somebody from working based on the idea that they're a direct threat because they're unvaccinated, it may be a difficult burden to meet unless you have a unique situation where your setup is such that people have to interact with each other or they can't really maintain distance. But like I said, I think that's a high burden to meet. Next slide, please. Okay, so if after going through the direct threat analysis, an employer determines that an individual who cannot be vaccinated poses a direct threat, the employer cannot, I repeat, cannot exclude that person from the workforce or take any action unless there is no way to provide a reasonable accommodation, obviously absent an undue hardship, which would eliminate or reduce the threat. So this kind of is carryover to the last slide. If you can make it work by spacing people out, moving people around, putting up plexiglass, any of those items that can reduce or eliminate the threat, you're going to have to accommodate them. And obviously you can have them work remote too, if that's an option. But if you can work with them, you're going to have to work with them. You can't say, well, my requirement is you have a vaccination, you don't get it, you're fired. You're going to find yourself in some trouble to do that. And I will say this, one of the things that has come up since COVID has hit is the impact on the reasonable accommodation process when it comes to remote working. You know, for so long, so many employers have been able to say, well, look, the essential duties of your job require you to work on site, and we can't allow for remote working. It's a little harder to make that argument now for many of us, because many of us have had most of their employees or many of their employees work at home for at least some duration of the last 11 months. And so I think it does become a little harder to make that argument that you can accommodate the reasonable accommodation. What is important to point out is that the employee does not pick the accommodation. The employer picks the accommodation. So if you don't want somebody to work remote, even though they potentially could work remote, you can work around that and say, okay, you know what, here's what we're going to do. You're unvaccinated. We're going to put up plexiglass, or we're going to really enforce our rules and make sure that no one's violating these rules to protect the workplace. And so you don't have to actually allow them to work from home. You can give them a different accommodation. Next slide, please. Okay. We've already discussed this. So the same is true for employers with religious beliefs against vaccinations. You have to accommodate them in the same way you would somebody with a disability. Next slide. Okay, so the question comes up, can you terminate an employer for refusing a vaccination if they fall within the scope of one of those exceptions? So, obviously it depends, and I kind of touched on this before. If you can accommodate them, you have to accommodate them. There's just no way around it, unless it's an undue burden. But in most cases, I think employers are going to be able to find a way to make it work. In environments that it's not possible, then yeah, it is possible to say, look, you have to work here. We can't make it so that we eliminate or significantly reduce the direct threat, and therefore we're going to terminate you. But I would strongly advise you in that situation to speak with legal counsel before you take action. Next slide. All right, I'm not sure how many on this presentation are union employers, but I will say that the National Labor Relations Board is likely to review requiring vaccination as a mandatory subject of bargaining, which means you cannot unilaterally, if you have a union workforce, you cannot unilaterally implement it without first bargaining over it to an impasse. So for I'm sure all of you union employers out there are aware of this and have probably been dealing with similar issues since the start of COVID. Just keep that in mind. And then also for both union and non-union employers, be aware that if an employee makes a comment critical of COVID-19 vaccination policy, whether it's that you're mandating it or you're not mandating it, I would be careful careful and think about it before you take action to discipline them for making those comments. And the reason is because even if you're a non-union workplace, if the employee makes a concerted effort or concerted criticism to question or criticize or complain about terms and conditions of their employment, even if they're non-union, that could potentially be a violation of the National Labor Relations Act. So while maybe an employee going on Facebook or somewhere else complaining that oh, my employer requires the vaccination or my employer does require the vaccination and is critical of it, if that can be tied to a complaint about a term and condition of employment, that's protected speech. And I would urge against taking action unless you talk to legal counsel prior to doing so. Next slide, please. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about before we turn it over to questions here is employer liability. So the question has come up a number of times. If your company chooses to mandate employee vaccinations, and the vaccination causes an injury to the employee, can the employer be held liable? So in short, the answer is yes. So the way this works is, of course, no decisions have really come out on this yet because the vaccine is so new. But from a workers' compensation perspective, you have an employer who is initiating policy, which is really for the benefit of the employer, if through that process, even if you send somebody off-site to get it, if they had a reaction to this, which I believe is very uncommon, but if that were to happen, I believe it would be considered a workers' compensation injury, which could subject you, most likely your workers' compensation carrier, to potential exposure for time off from work, medical expenses. And so that is a possibility. I mean, I don't know how likely that is. I think that there's been very, relatively speaking, very few significant negative reactions to the vaccination. But in the event that does happen, there could be some potential liability. And obviously, this is something that an employer should consider when it's making a decision whether or not to mandate their vaccination for its employees. Next slide. Okay, so for last, we'll flip it over to the other side of the coin, which is what happens if an employer decides not to mandate a vaccination policy for employees, and an employee ends up getting COVID-19, or multiple employees get COVID-19. Is the employer liable in those situations? Now, I'll tell you this: whether or not you require it or not, I don't think it really matters. If somebody were to obtain or contract the virus at work, it's going to be considered a work injury. Now, the difficulty becomes, how do you prove that? And I've been told, although I have not seen it firsthand, I've been told that the Department of Health has made determinations that certain individuals have acquired or contracted the virus through work. I'm not sure exactly how that determination is made. I'm not sure how a workers' compensation judge would view that determination. I think they would probably look at the evidence. I think if there is an outbreak at work, you have a stronger argument that it was contracted at work. However, there's, in my mind, and full disclosure, I represent an employer, so I'm typically arguing, against it being a work injury. But I would argue that, unless that person was living in a bubble, if they're going to the grocery store, they're going someplace else, they're just as likely or more likely to contract the virus there than through work, where we are following CDC guidelines and Department of Health guidelines. So I think it's a hard thing to prove. But if they do prove it, then they would potentially be entitled to workers' compensation benefits, which again would include potentially wage loss benefits and the medical benefits. Now, I think for the most part, people who contract this virus are not missing much time of work, and their symptoms are somewhat mild. And in those cases, the exposure to your carrier or to you, if you're self-insured, will be minimal. But in the other cases where it's more extreme and there's serious complications and there's a lot of medical treatments, and then maybe even if there's death, that exposure could be pretty significant. It's still too early to tell. These cases haven't really played out yet in the workers' compensation arena, and so we're going to learn more as this goes on. But just be aware that whether you have a policy mandating vaccinations or not, if it is determined that somebody contracts the virus at work, you will, from a workers' compensation perspective, likely be liable for workers' compensation benefits. So next slide. Okay, so this is just a summary page. Basically, can you mandate vaccinations? Yes, of course. There are those exceptions we talked about. Should you require them? That's up to you. It's up to what you think is in the best interest of your organization. At this point, I'm not really aware of many employers that are requiring it, but I think that could very well change once the vaccine becomes more available. We've discussed the liability for injuries. Again, that results basically one way or the other results in the workers' compensation area. I don't really see it spreading beyond that. As long as you're following, CDC and OSHA guidelines, your liability should be limited to a workers' compensation injury. If you're violating those rules, then obviously you can be held liable for being in violation of those rules and potentially negligence. But again, I think for the most part, it falls within the workers' compensation area. So with that, I know I went through a lot of information. I did want to make sure I save some time for some questions if there are any. So if Molly, if you can access the chat box and see if there's any questions on there.
We do not currently have any questions, but I would put it out to anybody. This is a perfect time to go ahead and put your question in that. And all you do is click on the control panel and hit that Q&A button, and it'll open up a little dialog box, and you can go ahead and ask that question. While we're waiting for any questions to pop in, I'll ask you, Bob, do you have any final thoughts? Any final?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think it's really, this is the starting point of the discussion. I think that, employers who are considering taking this really need to just do their homework. I do think they should talk to an attorney to, learn more about their specific situation. What I provided today was kind of generalities, but I do think that there's a lot of information that they need to consider before making the decision. There are pros and cons to both approaches. I do know that there are, some companies out there that, if they're a client of yours and they're, they may say, okay, well, look, I don't want to do business with you. I don't want to come in your workplace unless you get all your employees vaccinated. So that may put pressure on you from a different perspective. But again, if you are considering it for any reason, I strongly encourage you to do your homework and to talk to a labor and employment attorney and to make sure you're doing it the right way and you're fully aware of all the risks and benefits prior to enacting such a policy.
Okay, great, thank you. We did have a question come in, and they'd like to know your thoughts on encouraging vaccinations with payments. For example, $50 for the first shot, $50 for the second shot.
Yeah, I mean, I think encouraging is okay. I mean, I think there are some considerations out there with respect to discrimination. So for example, is if you're incentivizing somebody to get the vaccination, that's great, but that incentive is not available to somebody who is unable, for the reasons we already discussed, for getting that vaccination. So I think you have to be very careful. There may be a way to incentivize it that's not discriminatory. For those of you who've been through the process of trying to incentivize wellness from your employees, there's ways to incentivize it without actually attaching it to some specific action. You can't say, well, if you run 10 miles a week, we're going to give you a discount on your insurance, because if you do that, well, somebody who has a disability and is unable to run, that's discriminatory against them. They don't have that same option. So I would say be very careful about any incentives. And I would talk to counsel about your specific situation and your specific proposal prior to doing that. Generally, encouraging vaccinations, I think, is a good thing, but I'd be very careful about attaching an incentive to it that could be construed as discriminatory.
Okay, thank you. We had another question come in. The CDC and Department of Health mandate masks. Company reiterates requirement of mask during work. Employee habitually disregards wearing mask. What is employer's course of action?
All right, so you have to go through it. I don't know what the reason is for the person not wearing the mask. I mean, if you have a policy in place, and I'm going to make a lot of assumptions here. I'm going to assume that this is a non-union work environment, that they're an at-will employee. You can discipline somebody, generally speaking, for not following policy. You want to make sure you're consistent with that, and you're treating everyone the same way, and that you're forcing it equally among everybody. But the one exception to that would be if they have a condition that doesn't allow them to wear the mask. Like, for example, if they have PTSD and then the mask they can't wear the mask because of that disability, you would go through that same reasonable accommodation process. You basically say, look, our requirement is that you wear the mask. If you can't wear the mask and you think there's some, disability related or some reasonable accommodation that can be provided that would allow you to do your job regardless, fill out the form and provide that information, and we'll go through the same process. What are your restrictions? Well, I can't wear a mask because I have PTSD and it causes anxiety. And then you say, okay, well, what if we, give you a shield instead? Or what if we, put plexiglass up instead? And so there are ways to work around it, but I would be aware of a potential reasonable accommodation issue. If they are plain, no reason, plain and simple, just not following your policy, and they don't have any of those reasons, you can discipline them. Again, I'm assuming this is a non-union environment, that they're an at-will employee.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat box, or the Q&A box rather, but so we still do have time. So if you have questions, go ahead and put those in there. While we're waiting to see if anything comes through, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll, and that should pop up for you. It's just a few questions. It lets us know how we did today and how we might be of service to you again in the future. So if you wouldn't mind just answering those few questions, we greatly appreciate it. Again, there's still time to go ahead and put some questions in the Q&A box, but while we're waiting, I'm going to go ahead and take this opportunity to again thank Mr. Zaruta for his time and expertise today, for sharing this information with us. It sounds like it's a very fluid situation, and we'll know more as things continue. And as things change, we'll probably go ahead and put together another webinar as we start to learn things about the vaccination and COVID as we continue to move through this. So keep checking our website, nwirc.org, for more trainings to come on this topic and many others. Would like to thank everyone that joined us today for your participation and questions. We appreciate that. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and leave this up for another minute to see if another question comes through. And, you know, Bob, if you have any final closing comments you'd like to make before we close it all down, I'll give you the opportunity.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for their participation in today's webinar. Like I said, I think these presentations provided by the IRC are very helpful, and I encourage you all to participate in as many as you can. If you have you know, any questions regarding this or anything else after the presentation, you know, feel free to reach out to me. I kind of have a grace period of about 24 to 48 hours of these presentations, where I'm happy to follow up on any questions that were not asked, free of charge. So I encourage you to send me an email if you have any questions, and do my best to get back to you.
Okay, and if you don't know how to get in touch with Mr. Zaruta, feel free to reach out to me, and I will put you in touch.
Actually, if you go to the next slide, I think my email information is down there.
Okay, yep. Hang on one second. We'll go there. There we go. And we did just have someone just said thank you. I thought it was a question, but they just said thank you.
Okay. All right.
So,
thank you all.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope you all have a great day. Take care.